All right. Well, thank you so much, Anita, for that introduction to this short talk on the topic of navigating difference. This topic arose out of a conversation that Anita and I were having kind of in the wake of last year's national election, the attack on the nation's capital in January, and just this sense that there's a lot of polarization that we've come as a society to think about difference in a very particular way, in a harmful way, perhaps, in a way that seems to lead to, disagreements getting fired up and more intense rather than being resolved. And so I put forward this topic as a response to that conversation. And my hopes for today are really to do three things. The first is to explore our mindsets around difference, and then to attempt a biblical theological perspective on difference. After that, we'll discuss some practical frameworks for navigating difference in our real lives. And then we'll have small group discussion where you all can process a bit what's important about this conversation for you personally, or what's something that you might like to carry forward. Before I start, I just want to say this is my fourth time speaking to the Stephen Ministers on a topic. I've loved it every single time, mostly because I get to just choose to speak about a topic that I love. Maybe a topic on which I'm not an expert, but a topic where I have acquaintance and a lot of passion. And then to hear from you all about that same topic. Every single time, it's been something a bit bigger than we can really cover in the space of an hour, actually a little less than an hour. So I do hope that you'll consider this time as a starting point for continued reflection and discussion. This time, or this presentation, won't be a definitive take, so I want to set that expectation right there. I do want to say too, what brings me to this topic a bit, it really has to do with my life story. I grew up as a white girl in the Southeast. As many of you know, I think I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. I saw, in the span of my early years, how what it was like to be of a different gender, let's say, for my brothers. I also went to an all-girls school, and so thought a lot about what single gender education meant, because it was part of my own life. I also saw the way that race played out as part of the culture of the part of the South where I grew up. And when I got to college, where I went up north for college, so did something a little bit different for folks in my family, I had all these questions about the forms of difference that were most intimate to me. And so that really led me into an academic course of study in what's called Women's and Gender Studies. And that was my college major. And as part of that, I took a lot of coursework in the African American Studies department as well, because I was really curious to understand Black history and Black political thought. Some of those interests led me pretty directly into what I did right after college, which was I did Teach for America. I did it in a very unusual context for me, where I had no prior experience, which was in Navajo country in Northwest New Mexico. And so dove right into an experience of ethnic cultural difference that was really unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And I also taught special education, which brought me as an able person into direct contact that I'd never had before with people with disabilities. And so those are some of the main differences that, even since I was a teenager and in my early 20s, I've been interested to explore. And I did just want to kind of lay that out for you all to start. But let's dive in. So I'm going to ask you all to use the chat, if you can, to answer a really simple question, which is, what are ways that human beings differ from one another? And just to respond in the chat and kind of let your brain just go with it. So we've got age, race, politics to start with, but I'm curious about if you all might just, let's get a long list going here. I love some of these. So I dropped in having kids versus not having kids because I think sometimes we have differences in experience. Sense of humor is a lovely, subtle one. Um, income, athletic ability, right? I'm certainly someone who no one would say has athletic ability. Education, opportunities that you're born into, life experiences, eyesight. So that's a very nuanced way of thinking of ableness. So take a look over in the chat. But what you'll notice, I think, is that differences are very different from each other. So they may have to do with nature or with nurture or with both, right? We see things in both of those categories, many where there's kind of a crossover. Some differences have to do with choices that we make. Some feel more out of our control. And I hope you'll see that in these different terms, there's a lot of possibility. So take, for example, athletic ability. I might be a great athlete in a certain sport and not really have aptitude in another one. So even if I were to say, oh, he's a good athlete versus he's not a good athlete, I might mean that in a lot of different ways. So there's a lot that's contained in these categories. I'm also just going to bring out there right from the start that some of these categories raise more fear or anxiety in us than other categories, more of a sense of uncertainty than other categories. Maybe they feel more charged where others feel more neutral. So the first concept I really want to put out there for you all, I definitely want to name and trace it to my undergraduate experience. So one of the first courses that I took in gender studies was a course called Language and Gender. It was taught by a remarkable professor named Barney Bate, who's since passed. And he talked about how we do this thing in language and in culture, which is to frame difference as binary opposition. So we have one of these categories. Let's just take the first one on the list, age. And as basic building blocks in our language, we set up some opposites. Like we say, oh, you can be young or you can be old. I do want to invite you all to be on mute. I think we've got a little bit of audio cutting in. Or with race, here in the United States especially, we find ourselves talking about whether someone is white or whether they're Black. So even though, like I just said, there's a lot of diversity that exists in each category, we have this way of reducing things and then setting them against each other, not even just side by side, but setting them against each other, which is why I use that versus abbreviation. And what's wrong with this, right? We can probably think of more than one thing, just from our own personal experience, no theory involved. For one thing, it inevitably leads us to ignore subtlety in people's experience. We know personally people who have a parent who's white and a parent who's Black, and they have an experience that doesn't fit neatly maybe into either of those categories. Or we know that in between the time that you're an infant and when you're in the final years of your life, there's actually a lot of difference across the spectrum. It's not just two categories with a neat division. I imagine that as you look down this list that you, maybe even just for one or two of these things, might have a sense of, I'm not actually sure which one of those I fit into. Or maybe I've had an experience where over time, I've gone from being one to being the other. Maybe you grew up without a lot of social or class privilege, and then you were able to, maybe through education, other opportunities, to gain access to the resources that we associate with class, for instance. Maybe you've undergone a political shift in your life, from being more conservative to being more liberal or vice versa. Or maybe when you look at those terms, you think, I'm kind of outside of those things. The trouble with binary oppositions is that they really deny our lived reality in more than a few ways. And they reduce everything about being human to an either or when we know that there's a lot of both and in being a human being. And then there's a deeper issue, which is something our brains do with language, with binary opposition, is that we tend to assign to one of the two terms goodness or normativeness. We say this one is the normal one. And then to the other term, a sense of being secondary, bad, or abnormal. This is a cultural thing, and oftentimes we're doing it less than consciously, let's say. When we look at a list of two things, we tend to have a preference. And our culture can kind of support this. And I want to show it to you in language because I think it's one of the clearest places that we see it. So if you look down this list, there's some of these terms that you might describe as being, this is a linguistic term, marked versus unmarked. So let's talk about man and woman. So woman has an extra mark, a few extra letters on it to set it apart from man, which is the more normative category. Think about the word privileged, and then this word we hear a lot of underprivileged. It would be kind of weird to call someone overprivileged in our culture, but we use this word underprivileged a lot. And the marked category is typically the less desirable or less normal category for us. Now, of course, we know that that's a bunch of hogwash and that everyone's a human being and everyone is in the image of God, everyone is alike in dignity. But even in our language, we encode biases. And I point this out because I think it's something that we have to recognize in a way before we can move on. Difference in and of itself, you could say, is part of a binary and is the kind of negative one. Difference leads to conflict. Difference can lead us to strong feelings of being upset. Sometimes I think we're afraid, and we might be legitimately afraid, that difference will lead to violence. What's different can also be unknown or less known for us. And we fear the unknown because we're not sure that we can maintain control. The unknown might challenge us in ways that we're not sure we want to be challenged. It might require us to change. And we all know how resistant human beings can be to change. When we experience a sense of sameness with other people, there is an easier path towards empathy often. We feel connectedness over a shorter amount of time. And it can be easy, let's say at work or in your family with the people you agree with. It can be easier to make decisions and to take action, at least until you discover some way that you differ. All that being said, I don't want to put thoughts in your head or words in your mouth. And I bet you can think of situations where difference for you has been stimulating and enriching, refreshing, where you've noticed that it's beautiful that things are different. And I kind of want to push us to think in that direction, at least to think about difference in a more neutral or objective way. But then beyond that, I think with the Bible's help, I think we can even think more positively about difference and make an honest effort to do that. Conscious effort, maybe, is the word I'm searching for. So there's just a few texts that I want to bring into your minds. And the first is Genesis 1, which is the creation story where God makes the world in 7 days. So in Genesis, in the first chapter, and you can go and read it and you'll see what I'm talking about, there's one word that gets used an awful lot. And we're very used to thinking about, the word that gets used a lot in Genesis 1 is the word good. God keeps saying how good things are, and that's true. God does say that a lot. But a word that appears even more is the Hebrew word that's translated every. So as the world is being created in its original goodness, there's this sense of a multitude. All of these different creatures, all of these different plants, all of these different birds of the air, fish of the sea. And when God makes God's ultimate pronouncement about the state of creation, it says these words: God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good. So the everyness is part and parcel to the goodness of the world. We also know, of course, that every human being is made in the image of God. That's that piece about being alike in dignity. And as we hear in Wisdom of Solomon, which is not a book in our Bible, but these words: God despises nothing that God has made. Okay, great. Genesis is this nice, larger than life, sort of mythic text. Let's take it into the practical space. And nobody better to take us there than the Apostle Paul, who was constantly dealing with real life church stuff and real life difference. And I think we can learn from the way that he thinks about difference. So one passage that ought to come to mind for us is where Paul talks about the varieties of gifts that come from the same Spirit. We see a similar kind of repetition to in Genesis 1, where the word every gets said a lot. Paul says varieties a lot to make this point about the multitudinous ways in which people can be different. They have different strengths, and this, of course, is a gift. This is one of the places where he introduces the idea of the body of Christ, which I think is a very useful way for us to think about difference. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. And then, of course, he develops this metaphor in a few places to talk about how people bring different things to the whole, and everything is essential for the whole body to live. This is a God-given arrangement of things. I think that embracing this mindset, basically like expecting difference to exist and rethinking of it as an asset, is very applicable on its own. But I also know that you might be looking for practical advice about dealing with other people where you have differences of opinion or disagreements. And this passage doesn't really speak to that. So what do we do when we have differences in views and we can't seem to find common ground? I bring in Paul again, and this really great passage from the letter to the Romans. This is chapter 14, where he talks about welcoming those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. Some believe in eating anything, while the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? It is before their own Lord that they stand or fall, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand. So when Paul was writing to the church in Rome, he was writing to a church of strangers. This was not a church that he had founded. And he was speaking generally about the kinds of things that come up at this point in time in Gentile Christian communities, or in communities where Gentiles and Jewish Christians were mixing. And he knew that part of the difference was difference of opinion. There were lots of controversies in the early church. So there might be people who are weak in faith or newer to the faith who walk in the door. They're feeling pretty sure of themselves. And the more experienced believers are thinking, oh, they don't have that quite right. There were people who were, as part of their piety, eating different things from other people. So we know, for instance, that Jewish Christians, many were still keeping dietary laws, whereas Gentiles had no such laws. In this passage, we hear about some form of vegetarianism that was taking place that Paul had heard about, that was maybe being criticized by other people. And I think it's really interesting to see how Paul advises. He really only gives one positive instruction if you look at the verbs. He says, welcome. Welcome other people. And then he says it again later on when he gives his negative instruction. He says, don't pass judgment. Why? Because God welcomes the other. So God welcomes even the people that we struggle to welcome. I think Paul's making a really important theological point here, that every person you meet, especially the person you disagree with, it can be helpful to remember that that's God's person and not your person. Sometimes the beliefs and behaviors of others, they're just bound to bother us. They make us question ourselves. But many times, the beliefs and behaviors of others are well intended and they don't really impact anybody else but that person. I think it's really important for us to be able to recognize when differences really affect us, and when they don't. Differences create anxiety in us, but that's often not the same as they're being dangerous. You know, so someone states a strong opinion, maybe we aren't sure what to believe and that upsets us, but it doesn't endanger us. Or somebody really hates something that we like, you know, but in reality their dislike for it doesn't affect, it has nothing really to do with what we enjoy or think is important. The last thing I'll say about this passage is that across the board, Paul really resists a logic of supremacy. So he really resists saying that, something is really better than another thing. When he gets to this point, we kind of see why, because he says what really matters is why people do what they do. So he says, some judge one day to be better than another, while others judge all days to be alike. Let all be fully convinced in their own minds. Those who observe the day, observe it in honor of the Lord. Also those who eat in honor of the Lord, since they give thanks to God. While those who abstain in honor of the Lord and give thanks to God. So he's kind of like, whatever you do, what's really important is who and what you do it for. These were people who are disagreeing about essential things, like what day to worship God. That's what seems to be happening here. It's possible that some people wanted to worship God on Sunday because Christ rose on the third day, the Lord's day. Some people wanted to observe the Sabbath on Saturday, the same way Jewish people always had. And Paul says, either way is fine, so long as what is done in the right spirit. And so what I think the scripture offers us is an invitation to get curious about differences, and to ask, what's behind that? What's that about? If it bothers me, why does it really bother me? What does it have to do with me? What values might that practice honor for that person? I also think it can be provocative for us to think, and takes some imagination, but to think about, what might this look like to God? What does what they're doing or saying look like in God's eyes? And not to judge, not to imagine ourselves into that position of judgment, but more to think compassionately about the ones who we don't understand. Because I think when we can do that, we come a little closer to common ground. So this is where I do want to get practical for you all, to give you something to chew on, something to talk about in your discussion groups. I came up with these 5 things. So I hope the first one is really clear by this point. Expecting and welcoming differences. It's part of the way the world is for things to be different. And there's almost always, I'm going to say always, more than 2 ways about it. And so I think what we can do as part of expecting and welcoming difference is to notice when we are thinking in binaries, when we're thinking there's only 2 ways about it. Something that I've been thinking about for the past decade or so in my life is just noticing when things are breaking down into 2 categories, and especially noticing that when I have a strong feeling like for or against one of those things or one of those categories, or for my group and against their group. It's probably not so simple. And noticing that really helps me into a place of being more humble and soft-hearted, and makes me kind of lean in, like, what's going on here really? I know that this binary opposition is not the whole story, because when has that ever been true? I think it's also good to notice power relationships. I haven't really talked about this yet, but especially when you're in a group, it can be helpful to think about power. So for whatever reason, who in the room is in the privileged position? And that might be pretty unstable. It may be that there's a few people who have different kinds of power or influence. But I think it can be good for us, especially in our families, in our friend groups, work, to think about who's really in the position of power here. Who does everyone listen to? Who's speaking up? and then to notice who's not. And sometimes I think we have a responsibility, if we really value difference and see it as a good thing, to listen for and amplify the voices of the people who don't often get heard, or who might be disempowered in the situation. Because it's only coming together, like that body of Christ metaphor, right? It's only coming together that the whole is truly alive. So noticing power and amplifying voices, I think is really important in this day and age, especially. This fourth thing is something from my TFA days, that I've never really talked about in a church context, but I can connect it to faith, is to practice positive assumptions. This was something that was a large part of our anti-bias training when we started TFA. Our trainers knew that we were 22 and that many of us were going to be very naive about the communities that we were coming into to teach in. And they also knew that in the larger culture, whether or not we were fully aware of it, there were prejudiced views. Like, great example is the view that poor parents don't care about their kids' education. Okay, so they knew that we'd absorbed enough TV and film, maybe read some books, some news articles, whatever, that we might be coming in with this idea that those poor parents don't care. And so they said, you need to come in and actively assume the best, not only about your students, but about their parents. And if you do find, oh, so-and-so's parents don't care, not to start stereotyping, but to stay curious. I kind of feel like if you take nothing else away today, I'd love it if it were this: staying curious. Curiosity is so important to navigating difference. It's just continually being willing to ask the question, what's happening here? What is this about? So to use that same example, if a student's parents did seem disengaged, I would try to find out why. And there's a story. Sometimes they'd never had a teacher who stayed connected with them about their student before, and so they didn't really trust that I had good intentions, which is fair. And sometimes in the community where I served, the family might have a living memory of abuse in the educational context. So lots of times there might be a living grandparent who'd been forced to attend a government-run school. Maybe they had their hair cut off, their traditions stolen. Maybe they've had their mouth washed out with soap when they spoke the Dene or Navajo language. That had really happened to grandparents of students in my school. And sometimes a grandparent would be the primary caregiver for that child. And so there was really not a negative view of education. School didn't seem safe or good or trustworthy to that particular family. And it wasn't really fair for me to judge without welcoming the story and really upping my effort to listen and to be able to hold that with them. I'll just leave you with a couple of more ideas here. There's several of you all on this call I know who are really familiar with the work of Parker Palmer, but when I was in seminary and was involved in some work around racial justice, we would get together in conversation groups and we relied on Parker Palmer for group norms. And I associate several of his group conversation principles with staying curious. So he says, when the going gets rough, turn to wonder. So if you're starting to feel in that judgmental position, which the Apostle Paul warns us against, ask yourself, I wonder what brought them to this belief. I wonder what they're feeling as they're sharing what they're sharing. I wonder what my reaction teaches me about myself. So learning to be self-aware enough to set aside judgment is really important in navigating difference. And then what I'll leave you with is learning how to respond with honest, open questions. There's actually a lot that's technical to this. So asking curious questions is so important to staying curious. So many of the questions we ask in our personal lives and our professional lives are closed questions. They are not so curious. They have a yes or no answer or a right, really finite answer. So, are you okay? Weren't you sad? Okay. Questions like that, before anyone can tell you anything else, they have to get to a yes or a no. And in fact, what those questions end up doing is foreclosing explanation and storytelling. And we never mean this, right? But they might convey anxiety or judgment. Sometimes when we ask somebody like, are you all right? We know that we feel that empathically, and that's what we want to put across. But it can come across as, I need you to say yes so that I can move on, right? How are you? Fine. It's that kind of thing. And then I think sometimes when we inquire in a yes or no way into people's emotions, we can send a message that if they're not feeling a certain way, there's something bad or wrong or shameful about that, which again, we don't intend. Open questions, curiouser and curiouser, have many possible answers. And I've seen this described different places in different ways, but the thing that has been most transformative for me is when I'm entering into a conversation where I know there's disagreement or I know there's difference, to really be prepared with my how and what questions. I consider them the most curious because they really invite the whole story. They really invite the other person to go into it, and they give me an opportunity to listen with the least judgment. And so, dare I say it, when you find yourself in one of these situations where you feel a lot of difference and you're feeling the anxiety of that, how and what are my best friends, and I offer them to you. I'm not going to go over this. Do remember the preferred path. Sometimes, if you need to engage conflict, you can still do that curiously and creatively. And we have such good tools for that from our church.